I've never really cared about politics. I never talked about them much. But then, last November, the strangest thing happened. Now, I don't know if you've been following the news, but I've been keeping my ears open, and it seems like everyone, everywhere, is super mad about everything all the time. I try to stay a little optimistic, even though I will admit, things are getting pretty sticky. Here's how I try to look at it, and this is just me. This guy being the president, it's like there's a horse loose in a hospital. It's like there's a horse loose in a hospital. I think eventually everything's gonna be okay, but I have no idea what's gonna happen next. And neither do any of you, and neither do your parents, because there's a horse loose in the hospital. It's never happened before. No one knows what the horse is gonna do next, least of all the horse. He's never been in a hospital before. He's as confused as you are. There's no experts. They try to find experts on the news. They're like, we're joined now by a man that once saw a bird in the airport. It's like, get out of here with that. We've all seen a bird in the airport. This is a horse loose in a hospital. When a horse is loose in a hospital, you gotta stay updated. So all day long you walk around, oh, what'd the horse do? What'd the horse do? The updates, they're not always bad. Sometimes they're just odd. Be like, the horse used the elevator. I didn't know he knew how to do that. The creepiest days are when you don't hear from the horse at all. You're down in the operating room like, hey, has anyone, has anyone heard? Those are those quiet days when people are like, it looks like the horse has finally calmed down. And then 10 seconds later, the horse is like, I'm gonna run towards the baby incubators and smash them with my hooves. I got nice hooves and a long tail. I'm a horse. And it's like, oh, that's what I thought you'd say, you dumb horse. And then you go to brunch with people and they're like, there shouldn't be a horse in the hospital. And it's like, we're well past that. And then other people are like, well, if there's gonna be a horse in the hospital, I'm gonna say the N-word on TV. And it's like, those don't match up at all. And then for a second, it seemed like maybe we could survive the horse. And then 5,000 miles away, a hippo was like, I have a nuclear bomb. And I'm gonna blow up the hospital. And before we could say anything, the horse was like, if you even look at the hospital, I will stomp you to death with my hooves. I dare you to do it. I want you to do it. I want you to do it so I can stomp you with my hooves. I'm so crazy. And then for a second, we were like, maybe the horse catcher will catch the horse. And then the horse is like, I have fired the horse catcher. And he can do that? That shouldn't be allowed, no matter who the horse is. I don't remember that in Hamilton.
The Blaze Radio Network. On demand.
The best of the Glenn Beck program.
If you think the Supreme Court isn't that big of a deal, you may remember the horrible decision made by Chief Justice John Roberts on, not once, but twice on Obamacare, leaving Obamacare in place. And we're getting updates now on how that's going for everybody, which is really good. If you're one of these people who was skeptical on Obama, maybe you thought you weren't going to keep your doctor, or you're going to be surprised, because this is going really well. In 2009, the Obama administration authorized $30 billion in financial incentives to encourage the adoption of electronic health records in everything from large teaching hospitals to solo practices. Due to the administrative requirements, 40% of the providers who participated were penalized in 2016 for failing to hit the meaningful use targets. The administrative requirements were such a nightmare, Congress created a mass escape hatch in 2017, according to The Hill. Electronic data security has turned out to be another lie. A 2017 Accenture survey estimated that 26% of all Americans had their personal medical data stolen from electronic medical record systems. Half of those people ended up as victims of medical identity theft. On average, victims suffered a $2,500 loss in each incident. Now, I do remember the Obama administration telling us that we were going to save $2,500 when Obamacare was passed. Is it possible they just wanted to save us from the burden of having to spend that $2,500? Is that possible? I think we should at least entertain the possibility. But I mean, $2,500 per incident, and half of the people, that's what, 13% of Americans? In 2015, more than 100 million patient records were stolen. But this is where it gets really good. If you thought, I mean, those are mistakes, right? You have a new program, you want everyone to participate in it, and 40% blow it, and you have to pass an escape hatch. Okay, there's a little problem there. Sure, 26% of all Americans had their medical information stolen, and half of those had identity theft issues that suffered an average of $2,500 per incident. Sure, but those are mistakes. Here's the design of Obamacare, and this is where it gets really good. When the Obama administration restructured private individual insurance, it created bloated policies that people were not voluntarily purchasing. So you're forcing people to buy these things they don't want. To me, completely unconstitutional. For some reason, John Roberts disagreeing with that one. Not counting the money spent on state and federal exchanges, the federal government spent $341 billion from 2014 through 2016 on subsidizing individual coverage so that people would buy it. So again, you create this really crappy product that people don't want to buy. You force them legally to make them buy it. Of course, they don't want to pay that price, or they can't afford that price. So you take money from evil rich people and you give it to the insurance companies to subsidize the cost of these insurance policies. The cost, again, $341 billion from 2014 to 2016. All of this spending managed to increase private coverage by 1.7 million people, slightly less than half of the natural increase in the civilian labor force. So again, half of the natural increase was the amount of people that we actually increased coverage for in the private market. The cost per person, $200,000. We insured people at a rate of $200,000 per person. The feds could have saved money by closing the exchanges and giving people who qualified for subsidies a check for $50,000 for each of the 3 years. Those people could have then spent $20,000 for their own unsubsidized policy and used the rest to either cover out-of-pocket costs or buy a nice used car. $200,000 per person. And this is the case over and over and over again with these bloated government policies. And, look, the point where the Supreme Court shouldn't step in and say, hey, look, this is a bad policy. There is a policy out there. There's plenty of them in America where we waste a bunch of taxpayer money inefficiently on programs. That's something we do all the time. That was different than Obamacare because Obamacare was written incorrectly. We all know the whole tax versus fee argument. You go back and find out how they subsidize the states. These were all constitutional issues. And John Roberts basically went in and was like, you know what? I think the law should say this instead. And then just rewrote it. But the idea that these programs are a good idea in the first place, over and over again, we see the same scenario play out. $200,000 per person. You could just throw money at people. Throw it at them. and save money. You could save a lot of cash and a lot of taxpayer dollars and a lot of heartbreak. These are bad policies. They've hurt people. They've had to lose their doctors. They've lost access to the treatment they were receiving. And all of that costs us $200,000 per person. Insane. I don't know who's going to be in there to overturn it. I don't know if you had a new justice come in that was really conservative, would they have any chance at overturning parts of Obamacare? I mean, perhaps. But again, John Roberts is still there, and he seems to be the wonderful wall. He's the wall that we want on the border around Obamacare for some reason that no one seems to understand.
Glenn Beck.
And now joining us again on Book TV is Senator Rand Paul. His second book, Government Bullies. Senator, who are the bullies?
Well, all throughout your government, there's 41 different agencies who carry firearms now in the government. And you say, well, I don't mind the police or the FBI. Well, the Department of Agriculture has a SWAT team. The Fish and Wildlife have a SWAT team. In fact, the Fish and Wildlife raided Gibson Guitar with guns drawn, took all their computer equipment and their wood, and then didn't let them know what they were accused of for a year. But then when they finally accused them of something, it was breaking a foreign regulation, a law in India they were accused of breaking and penalized in the U.S. for breaking a law in India. Those are the kind of stories we write about.
How come we haven't heard about that before?
Some of them you have heard. One of them is the case of John and Judy Dollarite. They were selling bunnies in a little town of Nixa, Missouri. They were fined $90,000 for having the wrong permit. The government said, hey, you can pay on our website $90,000. But if you don't pay, in 30 days, you'll owe us $3.1 million. This is the kind of stuff that your government's doing to bully people, and we frankly think it needs to stop. They're doing the same with confiscating people's land and saying you can't build on it because it's a wetlands, even though there is no water or stream or pond on the land.
So as a senator, what can you do to change policy?
We've looked at some of these things, and we've now constructed legislation to try to fix them. So like on the wetlands, we say the Clean Water Act says you can't discharge pollutants into navigable waters. I don't have any problem with that. But your backyard is not a navigable water, and dirt is not a pollutant. So we try to redefine the Clean Water Act to make sure they're not putting people in prison for putting clean dirt in their backyard. And that's what's been happening. A woman in southern Mississippi got 84 months in federal prison without parole for putting clean dirt on her own land.
Senator, when you talk to your colleagues about these incidents, what do you hear?
Some are horrified, about 8 of them who signed on and co-sponsored my bill to try to fix it. The other 92, I'm not sure what they're thinking about. But when you tell the American people how the government's harassing, abusing, and even imprisoning people for selling raw milk, you can go to an Amish farmer. Some of these Amish farmers have been arrested and threatened with jail because they're selling milk to their neighbors.
Senator Paul, will you be taking these issues nationwide?
We're going to be talking about it everywhere anybody will listen, because we think government has gotten out of control, government's run amok, and government's become a bully, and someone's got to stand up to a bully.
It's November 2012, post-election. What did the 2012 elections clarify for you?
Boy, that we as Republicans need to do something to grow as a party. We're in danger of becoming a dinosaur if we don't figure out what people want out on the West Coast, New England, around the Great Lakes. They're solid blue. Till we figure out what people want, we're not going to win again as a party.
What do you think they want?
I think they are conservative. They think we should balance our budget, but I also think they don't think we should be at war everywhere all the time. I think they want a little more tolerant policy as far as putting people in prison for possession of marijuana. I think they'd like to see more local judges take care of that and less prison time. I'm not in favor of encouraging people to use marijuana, but I also don't think we should be putting people in jail for it either.
Now, this is your second book. We did a long-form interview on your first book. You can watch that at booktv.org. Just put Rand Paul into the search function. The premise of that first book?
The first book was The Tea Party Goes to Washington. It was about the Tea Party movement. I think it was an extraordinary movement, probably the biggest movement to happen in politics in our country in 40 years. A lot of people were showing up. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up at rallies. And it really transformed the way we think about things in the sense that people began to question whether or not the law that was passed by Washington, ObamaCare is one big example, whether laws were constitutional, whether the Constitution gave the government the power to do certain things. This hadn't come up really since the 1930s.
But again, the November 2012 elections.
Bring that up. I don't want to talk about 2012. I'm tired of 2012. Let's talk about the future. Now, 2012 wasn't very good for us, and we're going to have to figure out a way to appeal to a bigger electorate.
Are you running for president?
That's classified. I can't. Your clearance is not high enough to hear that. Now, I want to be part of the national debate, but I think it's too early to make that decision.
Government Bullies, the second book by Senator Rand Paul, how everyday Americans are being harassed, abused, and imprisoned by the feds.
The essay that you wrote that influenced me the most in my thinking was the unipolar moment in foreign affairs. In spite of everything now you've said, we look back over the last 20 years, the debt, the entitlements, the rise of China. Is that moment over? And if it is approaching its end, has it been well used?
It's a good question. And let me just say, it's in the book. There are 3 of those essays in the book. So purchase the book. Did I remember to do that? But not. That's only the first time, and we're almost done. Okay, I'll have to do it at least once more. Yes, I wrote it, and I gave it the title Unipolar Moment for a reason. It was not era, it's moment. These things, the fall of the Soviet Union was so historically anomalous, and leaving us without expecting it. Totally dominant in the world, economically, politically, culturally, in a way that really had not. If you look at 1991, you want to look at the time of the Gulf War, we were dominant in a way that you couldn't really say there was an example of since the fall of Rome. The distance between the number one power and number two was the largest in about 1,500 years. If you think of Britain at its peak, the distance between it and its rivals in Europe was always infinite. I mean, infinitely smaller. And any coalition on the continent could overcome the British, which is why they always were trying to get allies on the continent. But here there was no coalition that could challenge us. So yes, it was a historically anomalous moment. But it was a moment because it can't last. And I wrote at the time, I wrote this in 1990. And remember, at the time, people had said that if the Soviet Union collapsed, what would follow was not was a multipolar world where we would be co-equal with Europe, China, Russia, and others. But that didn't happen. It was this dominance. The reason that I called it a moment is because it would inevitably have to end. And at the time, I said if we don't screw up our economy, probably 30 years, 40 at the maximum. We are now at 20, almost a quarter century since. Have we used it well? I would think yes. I would think that we kept the world relatively at peace. We were able to police, for example, in the Gulf War, the more extreme elements. There are fewer wars, even though they get a lot of attention today than there have been historically in the last 500 years. Our dominance, I think, still remains. We're not quite where we were in 1991. I don't believe all the stories of American decline we get these waves of lack of confidence. We had during Sputnik, we thought that Japan was going to overtake us, and now the boogeyman is China. I don't believe any of this. I think the Chinese are going to get older before they get rich, in part because of the one-child policy, which has completely distorted their demographics. So I think our dominance is going to remain, and how we use it, the central task that I think is at hand is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. If you imagine a world 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and I have no idea how we're going to prevent this, but it will be a world where everybody has nukes, or almost everybody does. Can the human species survive that? I don't know, and I'm grateful I won't be around. But there's the next generation is going to have to work on this. What we're trying to do is we're at the very beginning of that era. Iran and North Korea are the test cases. Can we keep the genie in the bottle? I don't know. When I talked about the Fermi paradox, the speculation is that any time a civilization achieves the high technology, it's not long that it lasts. And I'll leave you with one number. I'll leave you rather pessimistic. The human species has been around for 200,000 years. We acquire nuclear weapons, and within 17 years, we come to the brink of nuclear annihilation at the Cuban Missile Crisis. 17 years after acquiring this power, we're already at the edge after having existed for 200,000 years before. So that gives you some idea of how precarious is a future. And that was only deterrence one-on-one. Imagine what it's going to be like. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia is going to have it within 6 months as a gift from the Pakistanis, and then Egypt, and then Turkey, and then everybody. I mean, it's going to spread and start. So we're going to be looking at a world that is going to be extremely dangerous, and we don't even know how to think about it now. So that's why in fact, I hate to end the discussion on this kind of note, because I leave people so pessimistic, melancholy. Sometimes there's weeping in the back of the room. So let me just remind you that I'm still licensed as a psychiatrist. And I'm sure you'll allow me, if anybody needs, I'd be happy to write a prescription for antidepressants, as long as you don't abuse it. Yes, sir.
Thank you for elevating the political debate.
People tend to fall into habits and into unquestioned ruts, especially in the field of government. On the market, in society in general, we expect and accommodate rapidly to change, to the unending marvels and improvements of our civilization. New products, new lifestyles, new ideas are often embraced eagerly. But in the area of government, we follow blindly in the path of centuries, content to believe that whatever has been must be right. In particular, government in the United States and elsewhere, for centuries, and seemingly from time immemorial, has been supplying us with certain essential and necessary services which nearly everyone concedes are important. Defense, including army, police, judicial, and legal. Firefighting, streets and roads, water, sewage and garbage disposal, postal service, etc. So identified has the state become in the public mind with the provision of these services that an attack on state financing appears to many people as an attack on the service itself. Thus, if one maintains that the state should not supply court services and that private enterprise on the market could supply such service more efficiently as well as more morally, people tend to think of this as denying the importance of courts themselves. The libertarian who wants to replace government by private enterprises in the above areas is thus treated in the same way as he would be if the government had, for various reasons, been supplying shoes as a tax-financed monopoly from time immemorial. If the government, and only the government, had had a monopoly of the shoe manufacturing and retailing business, how would most of the public treat the libertarian who now came along to advocate that the government get out of the shoe business and throw it open to private enterprise? He would undoubtedly be treated as follows. People would cry, "How could you? You are opposed to the public and to poor people wearing shoes. And who would supply shoes to the public if the government got out of the business? Tell us that. Be constructive. It's easy to be negative and smart-alecky about government, but tell us who would supply shoes. Which people? How many shoe stores would be available in each city and town? How would the shoe firms be capitalized? How many brands would there be? What material would they use? What lasts? What would be the pricing arrangements for shoes? Wouldn't regulation of the shoe industry be needed to see to it that the product is sound? And who would supply the poor with shoes? Suppose a poor person didn't have the money to buy a pair. These questions, ridiculous as they seem to be, and are, with regard to the shoe business, are just as absurd when applied to the libertarian who advocates a free market in fire, police, postal service, or any other government operation. The point is that the advocate of a free market in anything cannot provide a constructive blueprint of such a market in advance. The essence and the glory of the free market is that individual firms and businesses competing on the market provide an ever-changing orchestration of efficient and progressive goods and services, continually improving products and markets, advancing technology, cutting costs, and meeting changing consumer demands as swiftly and as efficiently as possible. The libertarian economist can try to offer a few guidelines on how markets might develop where they are now prevented or restricted from developing, but he can do little more than point the way toward freedom, to call for government to get out of the way of the productive and ever-inventive energies of the public as expressed in voluntary market activity. No one can predict the number of firms, the size of each firm, the pricing policies, etc., of any future market in any service or commodity. We just know, by economic theory and by historical insight, that such a free market will do the job infinitely better than the compulsory monopoly of bureaucratic government. How will the poor pay for defense, fire protection, postal service, etc., can basically be answered by the counter question, how do the poor pay for anything they now obtain on the market? The difference is that we know that the free market will supply these goods and services far more cheaply, in greater abundance, and of far higher quality than monopoly government does today. Everyone in society would benefit, and especially the poor. And we also know that the mammoth tax burden to finance these and other activities would be lifted from the shoulders of everyone in society, including the poor. We have seen above that the universally acknowledged pressing problems of our society are all wrapped up in government operations. We have also seen that the enormous social conflicts entwined in the public school system would all disappear when each group of parents was allowed to finance and support whichever education it preferred for their children. The grave inefficiencies and the intense conflicts are all inherent in government operation. If the government, for example, provides monopoly services, for example, in education or in water supply, then whichever decisions the government makes are coercively imposed on the hapless minority, whether it is a question of educational policies for the schools, integration or segregation, progressive or traditional, religious or secular, etc., or even for the kind of water to be sold, for example, fluoridated or unfluoridated. It should be clear that no such fierce arguments occur where each group of consumers can purchase the goods or services they demand. There are no battles between consumers, for example, over what kind of newspapers should be printed, churches established, books printed, records marketed, or automobiles manufactured. Whatever is produced on the market reflects the diversity as well as the strength of consumer demand. On the free market, in short, the consumer is king, and any business firm that wants to make profits and avoid losses tries its best to serve the consumer as efficiently and at as low a cost as possible. In a government operation, in contrast, everything changes. Inherent in all government operation is a grave and fatal split between service and payment, between the providing of a service and the payment for receiving it. The government bureau does not get its income, as does the private firm, from serving the consumer well or from consumer purchases of its products exceeding its costs of operation. No, the government bureau acquires its income from mulcting the long-suffering taxpayer. Its operations therefore become inefficient, and costs zoom, since government bureaus need not worry about losses or bankruptcy. They can make up their losses by additional extractions from the public till. Furthermore, the consumer, instead of being courted and wooed for his favor, becomes a mere annoyance to the government, someone who is wasting the government's scarce resources. In government operations, the consumer is treated like an unwelcome intruder, an interference in the quiet enjoyment by the bureaucrat of his steady income. Thus, if consumer demand should increase for the goods or services of any private business, the private firm is delighted. It woos and welcomes the new business and expands its operations eagerly to fill the new orders. Government, in contrast, generally meets this situation by sourly urging or even ordering consumers to buy less, and allows shortages to develop, along with deterioration in the quality of its service. Thus, the increased consumer use of government streets in the cities is met by aggravated traffic congestion and by continuing denunciations and threats against people who drive their own cars. The New York City administration, for example, is continually threatening to outlaw the use of private cars in Manhattan, where congestion has been most troublesome. It is only government, of course, that would ever think of bludgeoning consumers in this way. It is only government that has the audacity to solve traffic congestion by forcing private cars, or trucks, or taxis, or whatever, off the road. According to this principle, of course, the ideal solution to traffic congestion is simply to outlaw all vehicles. But this sort of attitude toward the consumer is not confined to traffic on the streets. New York City, for example, has suffered periodically from a water shortage. Here is a situation where, for many years, the city government has had a compulsory monopoly of the supply of water to its citizens. Failing to supply enough water, and failing to price that water in such a way as to clear the market, to equate supply and demand, which private enterprise does automatically, New York's response to water shortages has always been to blame not itself, but the consumer, whose sin has been to use too much water. The city administration could only react by outlawing the sprinkling of lawns, restricting use of water, and demanding that people drink less water. In this way, government transfers its own failings to the scapegoat user, who is threatened and bludgeoned instead of being served well and efficiently. There has been similar response by government to the ever-accelerating crime problem in New York City. Instead of providing efficient police protection, the city's reaction has been to force the innocent citizen to stay out of crime-prone areas. Thus, after Central Park in Manhattan became a notorious center for muggings and other crime in the night hours, New York City's solution to the problem was to impose a curfew, banning use of the park in those hours. In short, if an innocent citizen wants to stay in Central Park at night, it is he who is arrested for disobeying the curfew. It is, of course, easier to arrest him than to rid the park of crime. In short, while the long-held motto of private enterprise is that the customer is always right, the implicit maxim of government operation is that the customer is always to be blamed. Of course, the political bureaucrats have a standard response to the mounting complaints of poor and inefficient service. The taxpayers must give us more money. It is not enough that the public sector and its corollary in taxation has been growing far more rapidly in this century than the national income. It is not enough that the flaws and headaches of government operation have multiplied along with the increased burden of the government budget. We are supposed to pour still more money down the governmental rat hole. The proper counter-argument to the political demand for more tax money is the question, how is it that private enterprise doesn't have these problems? How is it that hi-fi manufacturers or photocopy companies or computer firms or whatever do not have trouble finding capital to expand their output? Why don't they issue manifestos denouncing the investing public for not providing them with more money to serve consumer needs? The answer is that consumers pay for the hi-fi sets or the photocopy machines or the computers, and that investors, as a result, know that they can make money by investing in those businesses. On the private market, firms that successfully serve the public find it easy to obtain capital for expansion. Inefficient, unsuccessful firms do not, and eventually have to go out of business. But there is no profit and loss mechanism in government to induce investment in efficient operations and to penalize and drive the inefficient or obsolete ones out of business. There are no profits or losses in government operations inducing either expansion or contraction of operations. In government, then, no one truly invests, and no one can ensure that successful operations will expand and unsuccessful ones disappear. In contrast, government must raise its capital by literally conscripting it through the coercive mechanism of taxation. Many people, including some government officials, think that these problems could be solved if only government were run like a business. The government then sets up a pseudo-corporate monopoly run by government, which is supposed to set affairs on a business basis. This has been done, for example, in the case of the Post Office, now the U.S. Postal Service, and in the case of the ever-crumbling and decaying New York City Transit Authority. The corporations are enjoined to end their chronic deficits and are allowed to float bonds on the bond market. It is true that direct users then would be taking some of the burden off the mass of taxpayers, which include users and non-users alike. But there are fatal flaws inherent in any government operation which cannot be avoided by this pseudo-business device. In the first place, government service is always a monopoly or semi-monopoly. Often, as in the case of the Postal Service or the Transit Authority, it is a compulsory monopoly. All or nearly all private competition is outlawed. The monopoly means that government service will be far more costly, higher priced, and poorer in quality than would be the case in the free market. Private enterprise gains a profit by cutting costs as much as it can. Government, which cannot go bankrupt or suffer losses in any case, need not cut costs. Protected from competition as well as losses, it need only cut its service or simply raise prices. A second fatal flaw is that, try as it may, a government corporation can never be run as a business because its capital continues to be conscripted from the taxpayer. There is no way of avoiding that. The fact that the government corporation may raise bonds on the market still rests on the ultimate power of taxation to redeem these bonds. Finally, there is another critical problem inherent in any government operation of a business. One of the reasons that private firms are models of efficiency is because the free market establishes prices, which permit them to calculate, to figure out what their costs are, and therefore what they must do to make profits and avoid losses. It is through this price system, as well as through the motivation to increase profits and avoid losses, that goods and services are properly allocated in the market, among all the intricate branches and areas of production that make up the modern industrial capitalist economy. It is economic calculation that makes this marvel possible. In contrast, central planning, such as is attempted under socialism, is deprived of accurate pricing, and therefore cannot calculate costs and prices. This is the major reason that central socialist planning has increasingly proved to be a failure as the communist countries have become industrialized. It is because central planning cannot determine prices and costs with any accuracy that the communist countries of Eastern Europe have been moving rapidly away from socialist planning and toward a free market economy. If central planning, then, thrusts the economy into hopeless calculational chaos and into irrational allocations and production operations, the advance of government activities inexorably introduces ever greater islands of such chaos into the economy, and makes calculation of costs and rational allocation of production resources more and more difficult. As government operations expand and the market economy withers, the calculational chaos becomes more and more disruptive, and the economy increasingly unworkable. The ultimate libertarian program may be summed up in one phrase: the abolition of the public sector, the conversion of all operations and services performed by the government into activities performed voluntarily by the private enterprise economy. Let us now turn from general considerations of government as contrasted with private activity to some of the major areas of government operation and how they could be performed by the free market economy.